everyone. Welcome to the EMSNation podcast. It is my privilege to host this foam resource, which of course I am preaching to the choir. Free, open, access, medical education. Why? To elevate our game, to take marginal gains on a daily basis so that we can provide the best, the most empathic pre-hospital care ever. And with that, I would love to introduce our distinguished panel that will be joining us on this very tight set, but we are going to be doing a live podcast. First up, we have Anne Creaton, an emergency physician and retrievalist, headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. She spent the last 4 years in Fiji establishing emergency medicine training in a low-resource environment while building capacity in the pre-hospital care and disaster response sphere. While living in Fiji, she experienced Cyclone Winston firsthand and was part of the in-country response. She's an educator in mass gathering medicine as well as the MIMMS system and was part of the instructor team for a multi-agency tabletop simulation for a terrorist attack in Melbourne, Australia. So next up, we have Dr. Lionel Lamhaut. Close. He's like, oh, come on, you could have done better. He's like, it's all right. An anesthetist with both ICU and EM training and an associate professor of the SAMU de Paris. Dr. Lamhaut is not only a disaster response physician, but an academician of the highest caliber with recent publications on the prospective deployment of ECPR for refractory cardiac arrest in the Paris area with a multicenter study well underway. He responded directly to the terror attack of Charlie Hebdo and was instrumental in the after-action analysis in the coordinated multi-site terror attack that struck Paris on Friday the 13th of 2015. And the last panel member needs no introduction whatsoever. Standing ovation for Dr. Raed Arafat earlier in the day. And a fun fact about him, he is a Knight of the Order of Romania. And I'm not sure what that means, but maybe, yeah, absolutely. He's kind of a big deal. So there it is. So before we start this live podcast, we really do have to do a tribute to first responders. We cannot begin this panel discussion without first acknowledging the daily commitment of the finest first responders spread all across this broad EMS nation. The concept of disaster response does not translate well to the civilian world. When people run, fearing for their lives from an evolving incident, we, as in every single person in this audience, is running with equipment and kit in tow towards the event. Why? To save lives. That is why we signed up to do what we do on a daily basis. We took an oath to train, treat, and take control of inherently chaotic situations. The meaning of being prepared for an all hazards disaster response is lost on our friends and family who may be watching terrible events unfold on the television at home. Whether it be a large alarm high-rise fire, a mass casualty transportation event, an explosion of an improvised nuclear device, or the now all too common active shooter incident, we train like we fight, preparing in earnest for society's worst case scenarios. And so, to those of us who seek further knowledge, education, and skills to respond when little is known so that we may save the lives of our neighbors, a tribute to the most sincere, empathic, and humble brothers and sisters I am privileged to call my EMS family. To those of us who have made the supreme sacrifice, we will never forget and will make every attempt to perpetually honor your memory by seeking to improve every single day we walk this planet. And with that, we set our intention to learn and bring home to our own colleagues and agencies the valuable lessons put forth on our distinguished panel today. Ladies and gentlemen, put a hand together for these fine folks. In the US, we have a saying, once you know one pre-hospital system, you know one pre-hospital system. All disasters, by definition, begin locally. How do you stratify the risks and potential hazards to your service and community? How do you prioritize what you guys should be training for?
which we start. In France, for example, we have a different level of stratification depending where is your disaster, in fact, and if it's a larger or a small one. We can be very local, or a large area, or national plan. But everybody has exactly the same training, in fact, because we have a national diploma certification for disaster medicine.
In Romania, we have a similar system to France, in fact, with some differences maybe. So we have the local response. You have seen the center we have nationally, so once we realize that something is bigger than what the local can do, if they don't request help, we may offer help. And the idea is we prepare a country to respond to disasters. We don't prepare only the local areas, so everyone must be prepared. So if there is tomorrow a big earthquake in Bucharest, we prepare the whole Romania to respond, and we equip the whole Romania to respond. The good positive things is that we have standardized equipment all over the country. The same ambulances all over, we buy them centrally, so the ambulances, the type B, the type C are standard. Then we have a national system which allows us to move resources without asking permission from the local areas, which means less time consumed and much faster response. So these are some of the issues we have.
Anne, please.
The ambulance service where I currently live use a risk hazard matrix, which will determine the level of response, and that will include the number of people involved, the complexity of the incident, such as infrastructure damage, etc., and the likely impact both in the short and long term. So it's a fairly scientific process. Obviously, they base it on past and frequent disasters rather on the future, which may be a whole new ballgame.
Lionel, the morning of the Paris attacks, your service helped facilitate a mass casualty interagency drill with over 70 plus simulated patients. And when I was visiting you in Paris, you said, we just came up with a crazy number just so we could really stress the system. In fact, when you were trying to disposition some of your patients later in that day, during the attack, some of the hospitals thought the drill was still ongoing. How fortuitous was it that the drill optimized the chain of survival from the Paris attacks? And then specifically, since there were so many ongoing loci of attack, what were the challenges you faced with egress, getting off the scene, given the terrorist location was unknown?
Exactly, during the November attack, because we work about terrorist attack from now a few years in France, we make an exercise, and the goal of this exercise is to coordinate between pre-hospital and in-hospital admission. And what we're doing, we invite all the director of trauma center in Paris to this exercise in the SAMU. And what we're doing, this is all director call another hospital to see what is the answer of hospital. And each time the answer was, yes, I can take one patient. Oh, okay, that's not enough. And they go back in the hospital in the same day, and they say, it's not possible to answer that. You have to take 10 patients when they call, you ask no more questions. And the night, when we call back, we said, this is a SAMU. We said, yes, I can take 10 patients. Okay, that's good. It's an exercise? No, it's not an exercise. We continue, it's a real life. For the second part of the question, that's for us, the first time we can reach the scene, but the police officer said, you cannot leave. You have to stay here. It's not secure. We don't know what's happening in the street around. We have some gunfire. You have to stay here. That means for the first time, we can do the damage control as we do every day. Golden hour, we go strictly to the hospital. We have to do a damage control ground zero, but during less than 1 hour on seat. That means we develop now what we call sanctuary. That means the first unit have to come at the scene and need to be able to do damage control during 1 hour or more, probably, since the police officer said, this is safe, you can reach the hospital. And we changed the police device to do a real corridor, to have a safe way to go to hospital very shortly.
Very interesting. And a bias in EMS, and certainly a bias in large EMS conferences, is to focus on dense urban centers that have exhaustive dispatchable assets at their behest. Switching to your experience in working in lower resource environments, when the cavalry is almost certainly not on their way, How do you prioritize your response and training? Also, how do you devise your stepwise training from tabletop exercises to multi-agency simulation drills?
So firstly, how do you train people in a low-risk environment? I think you've got to remember the system you require is the same. You need bystander or scene care, you need transport care, and you need reception. And it needs to be coordinated, and you need some communication. Now, who you use to perform those tasks may be different. Your equipment may be different. Your modes of communication and transport may be different, but the elements are actually the same. So you look for those people, and sometimes you may use taxi drivers, you may train people in the business world. You'll train who will do the job, and you can't afford to be too fussy at the start. Then when you sort of create a movement, people start to get a bit more interested. So I think it's remembering the system that you require. The components may be slightly different, but looking at a long-term goal of meeting a professional standard at some point. But starting with volunteers is the way a lot of ambulance services began. In terms of moving from tabletop to big exercises, I think we've got to remember that real-life progress is really non-linear, and we can have all these utopian dreams with our spreadsheets and our matrices, but the real-life experience is you need to be opportunistic. And certainly one of the big exercises we ran in Fiji was because the UN needed to do an exercise to evacuate their staff. So they agreed to moulage some patients, and it turned out to be a really great, big, multi-agency exercise, but it was really about grabbing the opportunity and saying, I want to be involved.
In the US, we use the incident command system, and I know that you're an educator of the MIMMS system. So for the non-MIMMS folks, or who may not have a familiarity with it, are you able to describe it briefly for us?
So MIMMS is a course that I believe started in the UK and is used in some countries around Europe and in the wider region and in Australia too. It's really about people speaking the same language, and I think that's really what you need when you're having a multi-agency effort, collaboration. So it's about having a system of giving the first situation report, and then it's really giving a structure to what components you need. So there's a couple of acronyms that we use, like methane, which is the first sit rep, and then CSCAT, which is talking about the components of response. So things like assessing the scene, safety, triage, transport, and treatment and transport. So it's really about the practical elements. It's not particularly aimed at doctors. We can train a wide range of people. Certainly, I was involved in a course in Timor-Leste recently, and we graduated the first IT professional instructor. I think there's a real benefit of cross-training individuals who are from the business world, who are from all sorts of walks of life into these courses, because they are the people who will be in the communities that are really affected. So particularly in low-resource environments, it's worthwhile utilising those people.
Fantastic. Riot, we were all fascinated. I was literally sitting on the edge of my seat when you described the response to the mass casualty disaster fire situation. If you have a moment or two, can you dig into those 88 intubated patients? That just blows my mind. How is that even possible?
Well, it was possible because, given the fact that the hospitals were nearby, we didn't stop to intubate everyone there. The other issue which we saw in the fire is that the triage, the usual triage you teach the firefighters and so on, which is if they are walking, they are fine, it doesn't work here. Because, of course, you have people who may have 80% burns and they still are walking and then they just collapse in front of you. So what happened is it was a mixture of local emergency delivery up to the high level, but also evacuation of patients towards hospitals which were only 5 or 8 minutes away. And the police was very well in opening corridors for us towards all the hospitals. So it was a mixture which allowed us to get the 88 intubated, whether outside or inside, and at the same time, let's say, avoiding having more deaths on scene. Most of those who died on scene were already in cardiac arrest, and some of them underwent resuscitation. Only one, as far as I know, succeeded and was taken to the hospital, but she passed away a few days later in the hospital. So that was the situation. But I want to add one thing. I think that it is very important when we are planning our exercises is to start thinking of the unthinkable. What we observe is that when we plan exercises, we usually plan them up to our capacity so that we are happy that the exercise went on well. We need to see that the exercises really test us to the maximum capacity we have, and we have to see where we fail. The failure point must be identified, and then we need to know what we need to do so that we move this point to another level. Because now we are not talking anymore about 10 victims or 20 or 30 we've seen in Paris. And we should start thinking of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000.
Exactly.
This is what we need to start thinking of. How are we going to deal with the 2,000 injured people incident? And how are we going to move resources? And what are we going to do there? We are using now virtual reality exercising, and we already did an exercise last year under NATO. 14 countries participated, and we did an exercise with 2,000 injured due to a chemical plant explosion and so on, with toxic, which is a very realistic scenario anyhow. And we evacuated also 20,000 people. And we tested the system if we can. We were talking to the Ministry of Transport. We want to evacuate 20,000 people. How can we do it? Can you give us trains? Can you give us this? Can you give us that? And we were really testing the system to see how far it can go. I think this is what we need to start working on in the future.
Fascinating. An under-stress component of the disaster response cycle is demobilization. But even more important in the aftermath of an event is community resiliency. After the Sandy Hook shooting in Connecticut, where several school children were killed, the Hartford Consensus created a multi-part document with the last section focused on increasing national resilience. Can you talk about how important resilience is in the communities where you've all responded to disaster events?
Can I start? Well, resilience, so that we understand, resilience is the fact that we should come back to the normality as fast as possible. When we are looking at big disasters, resilience is not only in the medical system. You need to look at energy, water, food, transport, continuity of care. How many of us have our emergency departments with continuity plans? What if key persons 1, 2, 3 don't show up? Who's taking their place? And all these issues. What if the communication systems fail down? How are we going to communicate alternatively? And all these issues make part of resilience. And in Romania, we have 7 groups now which are working on 7 points of resilience which NATO have introduced now, which we call them the 7 baselines. It's continuity of governance, which can go down to a service, communications, energy supply, water and food, transportation, and so on. So these groups, mass casualties with thousands, mass movements, and the healthcare you need to give to mass people who are moving, refugees or otherwise, internal or external. So all these issues, we need to look at them and plan for them.
I think the resilience, depending where you work, because depending really the political way and everything, because, for example, in France, we have a large resilience after each attack. You can see after Charlie Hebdo, we have a movement in the street that's amazing. 2 million people, I think, if I'm good to remember. Anyway, the resilience is because all the services can do exactly continuous of care as they have to do every day, very shortly after the disaster. And what we're doing, we put the victims at the center of the system. That means, for example, in France, for each disaster, you have some psychiatric unit go directly on the scene and take care of everybody to be sure everybody have care, psychiatric care, and that means the society take care of everybody. That's a resilience.
That's so unique. I'd love to poll the audience. So if you didn't catch what Lionel said, he said for every disaster, a psychiatric unit is automatically dispatched to that scene. Does anybody else have that in their system?
Yeah.
I see 4 hands in the room, 4 or 5 hands.
Psychology, yeah.
Can you talk to us more about that?
This is very important.
How did you implement that system? Why is it so uncommon now?
20 years ago, we implement that. We have a psychiatric in call 24 hours, and they can be developed very shortly after every incident or mass casualty.
From a developing world perspective, and particularly the islands of the Pacific that are very vulnerable to natural disasters, I was living in Fiji when Cyclone Winston struck, which was one of the biggest cyclones to ever make landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. And actually seeing the community resilience was quite tremendous, that the people who weren't affected just immediately mobilized, gathered food, gathered clothes, packed containers, tried to get things out by sea, any of the roads that were passable. It was a real, a whole national effort, if you like, as well as all the aid coming in, which takes some days to actually arrive and be organised by the government and other agencies. So I think just to think about the level of community there is in these small islands, that I think the more we can train first responders in every country and make it part of perhaps schooling education, the more the community will be a community and will feel empowered to act. And that level of background community resilience will be there. And I think we've actually lost some of that in the more developed countries. Yeah.
Fantastic. Mike, we're out of time. Can we switch to see if there are any Twitter questions? And what I'd like to do in the meantime is to challenge you guys. So the National Association of EMTs recently did a US-based study which showed the overall preparedness for disaster response was abysmal. As you can see from our panel, they really prioritize integrating disaster response into daily response as a priority. So what I'd like you guys to do is to tweet us the challenges that you experience with disaster response so that we can potentially assemble the panel for a round 2 and really dig into the questions that affect you locally. Hey friends, thank you so much for listening to this live podcast recorded at SMACForce, the premier international pre-hospital resuscitation conference coming at you from Berlin, Germany. We really hope that this podcast was not only inspirational, but really sparks curiosity and questions for your own response to disasters within your own agency and community. After all, we know that all disasters are local. If you're interested in attending SMACForce next year, unfortunately, there will be no SMAC during the 2018 year, and instead we'll be reconvening in the Southern Hemisphere in February of 2019. But subscribe to the iTunes podcast, EMSNation, and there will definitely be lots more content coming your way from SMAC, including more podcasts as well as blog posts. This is Anne Creaton, Raed Arafat, as well as Lionel Lamhaut, and your host, Faizan Arshad, wishing everyone a safe tour.